Welcome to Medmarc's webinar series. Today's presentation is titled Medical Device version 2.0, Safer but Riskier. I'm Kate Klaus, Senior Attorney in Medmarc's Risk Management Department. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenter, Matt Marshall, thank you for joining us. Matthew L. Marshall litigates product liability cases primarily in the life science industry in matters involving medical device, pharmaceutical, and dietary supplement claims. Matt's medical device clients include manufacturers and distributors of dozens of different types of Class 3, 2, and 1 devices. Matt also represents pharmaceutical manufacturers and distributors in product liability cases, including sponsors and contract research and manufacturing organizations in clinical trials litigation. He also represents manufacturers, distributors, ingredient suppliers, and contract manufacturers of medical device, dietary supplement, and other food products. Additionally, he represents testing labs in personal injury litigation. Matt has also served as national and regional counsel in several coordinated mass tort litigation and class actions. And with that, I am pleased to turn things over to Matt.
Thank you, Kate. And thank you, everyone, for attending, and a big thanks to Medmarc for offering these webinars on a more than once a month basis. Sometimes it's very nice. So the title of my presentation is Medical Device version 2.0, Safer but Riskier. And I want to discuss medical device improvements and what the litigation and compliance implications might be when a company or firm decides to make those product improvements. The presentation will address what is meant by the term continuous improvement in the medical device context and why that's important. I'll discuss briefly how continuous improvement potentially impacts litigation and how it might implicate regulatory concerns, and also what are some of the best practices when it comes to a device's or a company's decision to improve a device. So first, what is meant by continuous improvement? We've all heard it in defending our clients and their designers or their regulatory affairs witnesses, but it's defined as the ongoing process of identifying, analyzing, and making incremental improvements to systems, processes, products, or services. So Benjamin Franklin, some call him the first American. He may have also been the first medical device inventor as the inventor of bifocals, but if you didn't know that. But he said, without continual growth and progress, such words as improvement, achievement, and success have no meaning. And I think most of our medical device clients and other life science clients would agree. That said, continuous improvement is not an abstract concept. It is actually contained in the International Standardization Organization, Section 9001, in which it's defined as an ongoing effort to improve your organization's products, services, and/or processes. Why is that important? Well, it is required by the Quality System Regulation 21 CFR Part 820. And compliance with 21 CFR Part 820 is a required condition of any 510(k) clearance of a Class 2 medical device. If you look closely at any of your clients' clearance letters, you would see this language in that letter. It is a directive from FDA. You must comply with all the Act's requirements, including, but not limited to, good manufacturing practice requirements as set forth in the Quality Systems Regulation 21 CFR Part 820. In January of last year, FDA issued a final rule amending the device current good manufacturing practice requirements of the Quality System Regulation under 21 CFR 820 to align more closely with the International Consensus Standard for Quality Management System for medical devices used by many other international jurisdictions. FDA's rule amends 21 CFR 820 by incorporating by reference QMS requirements of the international standards specific for medical device quality management systems as set forth in ISO 13485. In so doing, FDA determined that the requirements in ISO 13485 are substantially similar to the requirements of the quality system regulation and provide similar levels of assurance in a firm's quality management system and its ability to consistently manufacture devices that are safe and effective in compliance with 21 CFR 820. ISO 13485 is a globally recognized standard for quality management systems in the medical device industry, and it requires all organizations to focus on what we're just discussing, at least in part today, continuous improvement. The EU, Canada, and Japan also require ISO 13485 certification as a prerequisite for market entry. And as you will know, most firms try to have one set of governing standards in their quality system, so that they are not complying with multiple jurisdictions. They have one set of requirements which they follow. And FDA's effort was the rule is an effort to standardize certification across jurisdiction. Homer, the great author of antiquity, once said, "After the event, even a fool is wise." And if you have defended any life science litigation, that's also restated as hindsight is 2020. I couldn't find any inventions that were created by Homer, although Homer Simpson was a manufacturer of durable medical equipment because he manufactured the Lazy Man reclining toilet chair. It's the best that I could do, and I apologize for the Simpsons reference. So what are the litigation concerns? When we're dealing with a plaintiff or a plaintiff's counsel that's saying, it's so easy, you should have known this problem existed, you should have addressed it with a device improvement. What are the concerns in litigation? Well, a device improvement are necessarily subsequent remedial measures. Subsequent remedial measures are defined as an improvement to a device's design, manufacture, or labeling that occurs after an injury-inducing incident caused by a device. Subsequent remedial measures are addressed by Federal Rule of Evidence 407. 1 second here. Which reads, subsequent remedial measures are measures that are taken that would have made an earlier injury or harm less likely to occur. And evidence of subsequent measures is not admissible to prove negligence, culpable conduct, a defect in a product or its design, or a need for a warning or instruction. The rule continues, but the court may admit this evidence for another purpose, such as 1, impeachment, or, if disputed, proving ownership, control, or feasibility of precautionary measures. What are some issues that arise when discussing the issue of feasibility? It was too expensive to make the change, or making the improvement would have raised other safety concerns, or making the proposed improvement would not be permitted under the device's 510(k) clearance. In cases where the evidence is admitted for the issue of feasibility, what I've seen in the case law is that when admitted, the exception generally swallows the rule. And when the court thinks it's admitting this evidence for a limited purpose, good plaintiffs' attorneys will drive a truck through this exception and make the case about the firm's or entity's failure to make the product safer, and that failure was the reason for the plaintiff's injury. The prior version of Rule 407, which existed prior to the 1997 amendment, was somewhat different and less specific, at least in the context of strict products liability. It read, evidence of measures taken after an event, which measures, if taken before it occurred, would have made the event less likely to occur, is not admissible to prove negligence or culpable conduct in connection with the event. As I stated earlier, the rule was amended to clarify what was meant by culpable conduct, or to expand the cases in which such evidence would not be admitted. That evidence would not be used to prove, quote, a defect in a product or its design, or that a warning or instruction should have accompanied a product. Notwithstanding the amendment, at the time, a majority of circuit courts had interpreted Rule 407 to apply to products liability actions and not just negligence actions, i.e., strict liability. However, at the time, and continuing until today, which I will discuss in a moment, a minority of courts had read into the prior rule an exception for strict liability. Since strict liability, it's not determined by culpable or negligent conduct, but rather whether or not a defect existed that caused the alleged injury. One of the jurisdictions in which I practice, California, has adopted a section in their evidence code which is similar to the pre-amendment version of Rule 407. California Evidence Code section 1151 reads, when after the occurrence of an event, remedial or precautionary measures are taken, which, if taken previously, would have tended to make the event less likely to occur, evidence of such subsequent measures is inadmissible to prove negligence or culpable conduct in connection with the event. The exclusionary rule of Evidence Code section 1151 generally does not apply to an action based in strict liability. In a fairly old case, 1974 case, Alt versus International Harvester, the plaintiff was injured when a car in which he was a passenger plunged 500 feet to the bottom of a canyon, and the key evidence was a broken gearbox. 3 years after the accident, the defendant substituted malleable iron for aluminum 380 in the manufacture of the gearbox. The Alt court held that the evidence was properly admitted. The Alt exception to Evidence Code section 1151 extends to all categories of product liability claims. So that would be design, manufacture, or warnings or labeling defects. Second jurisdiction in which I practice, Colorado, has taken a similar approach. Colorado Rule of Evidence 407, again, mirrors the pre-amendment version of the federal rule. It reads, when after an event, measures are taken which, if taken previously, would have made the event less likely to occur, evidence of subsequent remedial conduct is not admissible to prove negligence or culpable conduct in connection with the event. The rule continues. The rule does not require the exclusion of evidence of subsequent measures when offered for another purpose, such as proving ownership, control, or feasibility of precautionary measures if controverted, or purposes of impeachment. The Colorado rule does not contain the amendments to Federal Rule 407 that expanded the scope of the exclusionary rule to exclude evidence of subsequent measures to prove a defect in a product or in its design or a need for a warning or instruction. This was articulated in a case called Forma Scientific versus Biosera, which in essence adopted the Alt rationale from California. I like to call Colorado California Junior, because many times what happens in California ends up happening in Colorado. The Forma holding was based on the Colorado Committee comment to the Rule of Evidence 407, which stated, the phrase culpable conduct is not deemed to include proof of liability in a strict liability case based on defect where subsequent measures are properly admitted as evidence of the original defect. Case law suggests that Colorado courts would apply strict liability, would apply this exception to strict liability failure to warn cases as well. And it would not apply to strict liability design defect cases brought in the Federal District of Colorado because of the Erie Doctrine. The interpretation of Colorado Rule 407 would be substantive, and thus a court sitting in diversity in federal court would adopt the substantive law of the forum state. And in this case, it would not apply the Rule 407 of the Federal Rules of Evidence. Other states are similar, some more expansive in the way that they address evidence of subsequent remedial measures. For example, the Alaska Rules of Evidence Rule 07 states, this rule does not require the exclusion of evidence of subsequent measures when offered for another purpose, such as impeachment again, or if controverted, proving ownership, control, feasibility of precautionary measures, or defective condition in a product liability action. So don't go to Alaska. Similarly, in Connecticut Code of Evidence Section 4-7, Subpart B, has a specific section that addresses strict product liability of goods, which provides where a theory of liability relied on by a party is strict product liability, evidence of such measures taken after an event is admissible. Hawaii HRS Section 626-1, Rule 407, provides the rule does not require the exclusion of evidence of subsequent measures when offered for another purpose, such as proving dangerous defect in products liability cases, as well as the other usual suspects. Missouri, which I learned does not have its own standalone evidence code, and its evidence rules are determined through common law, again, has adopted the exception for strict liability cases, finding that subsequent remedial measures are admissible to show defect, and that's in the case of Pollard versus Ashby. It's a 1990 case. Maine and Texas have taken a somewhat more limited approach. Maine Rules of Evidence 407B provides that in situations where there is a notification of a defect, it reads, notwithstanding subdivision A of this rule, a manufacturer's written notification to purchasers of a defect in its product is admissible to prove the existence of a defect. So think of a recall, think of a notice of a safety alert, or think of a notice of a retrofit that's being offered by the company. Those notices would be admissible to prove the existence of a defect. Texas, similarly, in Rule 407, Subpart B, provides that a manufacturer's written notification to a purchaser of the existence of a defect in one of its products is admissible against the manufacturer to prove the defect. Lastly, small but mighty Rhode Island. Rule of Evidence 407 takes the most expansive view in its rule, which provides when after an event measures are taken which if taken previously would have made the event less likely to occur, evidence of the subject measures is admissible, without exception, without qualification. George M. Church once said, it's not just a matter of saying we want the world to be safer, we have to create technology. And I think our life science clients would agree. George Church is a geneticist and invented some methods of genome sequencing. I have no idea what that is, but he seems like a pretty smart guy. So that's why I included his quote in this presentation. So when a company wants to improve a device, what are some of the regulatory concerns? We've discussed the litigation concerns. Now let's get into part 3 of the presentation. What are the regulatory concerns? Well, first off, the company is going to, in case of a Class 2 device, make a determination if whether another 510K would be necessary in light of the proposed improvements to the design, manufacture, or labeling of the device. FDA has published a guidance, which in essence is exactly that, when to file a 510K for your device improvement. The guidance provides as follows. A 510K is required when a device in commercial distribution is about to be significantly changed or modified in design, components, method of manufacture, or intended use. Of course, that begs the question, what is a significant change or modification. The guidance defines those as well. A change or modification in the device that could significantly affect the safety or effectiveness of the device, e.g., a significant change or modification in design, material, chemical composition, energy source, or manufacturing process, and/or a major change or modification in the intended use of the device. Stated otherwise, a significant change or modification is a significant change or modification. There's not much guidance there, and unfortunately, many times, a significant change or modification will be whatever FDA determines that to be. Nonetheless, when considering a device improvement and whether or not a 510(k) is necessary, the guidance requires that the company must perform a risk-based assessment to determine if proposed improvements or changes significantly affect the safety or effectiveness of the device. If after performing the risk-based assessment, the company determines that such changes will significantly affect the safety or effectiveness of the device, a 510(k) is necessary. You may have seen this in your client's document. It's a flow chart, and they have to fill it out. They have to keep it in writing in addition to any risk-based assessment, and document their file. And that's also what they have to do whether or not they determine a 510(k) is necessary. If a company determines after the risk-based assessment that a 510(k) is not necessary for the proposed change, GMP requires that it prepare a memorandum to file, setting forth the results of the assessment and the rationale not to submit the 510(k). Then, as we'll see later on, if the FDA takes the position that a device is unapproved or unauthorized when it should have been, the company will at least be able to establish due diligence and potentially provide clinical data to support its change or the reasons not to submit the new 510(k) or the supplement 510(k). The great orator Cicero once said, "The safety of the people shall be the highest law." I learned in preparation for this webinar that Cicero was also an inventor, along with being a principal orator and politician in ancient Rome. He invented Tironian shorthand. I don't know what that method of shorthand is, but I do know it included the invention of the ampersand. So the next time you use an ampersand, you can thank Marcus Tullius Cicero. All right, so what happens when a company does not submit a 510(k)? They make the change, and then FDA is of the opinion that they should have. It is a serious warning letter, potential corrective action by FDA, because the failure to submit the 510(k) and then to continue to market the device with those changes in place, the FDA will consider the device to be misbranded and adulterated due to the failure to file and submit the 510(k). And this can be any aspect of the device: its design, its manufacturing, or its labeling. In the first quarter of this year, FDA issued warning letters to two firms, Dexcom Inc. and I believe it's pronounced Capel Medical, QAPEL, for unauthorized changes to their devices that were inconsistent with their 510(k) clearances. Dexcom had changed the design of a component used in the coating of the sensors for its continuous glucose monitors. FDA concluded that the changed coating caused higher risk for users who rely on the sensors to dose their insulin. With regard to Capel Medical, they had developed an aspiration catheter which had a designated inner and outer diameter. They had promoted the device as being capable of expanding the distal tip to larger diameters or compressing it during clinical use. And these factors, or this ability, was not included in the original submission. And the FDA sent the warning letter advising them that they considered the device to be adulterated and misbranded due to their failure to provide the clinical data in support of the promotion of these additional previously undisclosed uses. Thomas Edison, who was a great inventor, once said, "There's a way to do it better, find it." Thomas Edison invented the fluoroscope, which I didn't know is one of the few medical devices that he actually invented. This quote is important because of kind of the mandatory language in it. The obligation here is, or the presupposition is that there's a better way to do it, and then inventors must find it. I read that quote and I was looking into kind of some topical issues surrounding device improvement. It necessarily gravitated toward the Gilead Life Sciences case, which many of you are familiar with, but it involves a new duty under California law, the duty to innovate. The drug at issue, it arises when the drug at issue is not defective, but is there a duty to develop an alternative drug that is allegedly safer for some users? And I say drug, but the potential scope of this case would extend to not just drugs, not just devices, but any product, at least in California litigation. The case is Gilead Life Sciences versus Superior Court, and it's currently pending before the California Supreme Court. In the underlying case, the plaintiffs contended that although the drug they took was effective in suppressing HIV, the active ingredient caused harmful side effects. Plaintiffs argue that Gilead did not timely develop a different, equally effective but safer drug, or had intentionally delayed its development, in essence, to maximize profitability from the first drug and then introduce the second drug. Gilead filed a motion for summary judgment, arguing that the plaintiffs were required to prove that the product was defective. Not very controversial for a defendant to argue that. We argue that in every single motion for summary judgment that is filed in a products liability case. Nonetheless, the trial court denied the motion, permitting the plaintiffs to proceed on a negligence theory premised on a purported delay in developing a safer alternative drug. And on appeal, California Court of Appeal affirmed. What's frightening about this case is that Gilead's briefing on appeal cited to virtually every case on which we usually base motions for summary judgment in all types of California products cases. Very straightforward. Plaintiffs must prove, 1, the existence of a defect, and 2, that that defect caused their injury. And that is not what this Gilead case is about. In the Court of Appeals decision, the court focused on the viability of negligence, or the continued viability of negligence claims in product liability cases in light of the availability of asserting strict liability, which does not involve a requirement or any element of negligence on the part of manufacturer. As I stated in the previous slide, it merely requires plaintiff prove the existence of a defect and that that defect caused the injury. The opinion ignored the elephant in the room because no one was really arguing that a plaintiff could not continue to assert negligence claims in product liability cases where strict liability was available. In any case, certainly in California, but most cases, plaintiffs will be asserting negligence theories as well as strict liability theories. And unlike the cases cited in the Court of Appeal, the Gilead case involved a similar but entirely different product, and not the product actually ingested by the plaintiffs. When you read the opinion, you get the impression, or at least I did, that they're knocking down a straw man with this argument about the viability of negligence claims, because nowhere in the motion or in the respondent brief did Gilead take the position that negligence wasn't available. Their focus at the trial court stage and appeal is the 100 years of product liability common law in California says the plaintiff must prove that the product that they used had a defect and caused them an injury, or that the product was negligently designed, manufactured, and labeled and caused their injury. So what are the implications if the decision is affirmed? I'll add one thing, the one good thing from the Court of Appeals opinion. The plaintiffs at trial or at the Superior Court had also prevailed on a theory of fraudulent concealment. The motion was denied as to that cause of action. That portion of the trial court's decision was reversed, but it is really of little consequence because fraudulent concealment is a factually specific case-by-case circumstance, whereas the negligence theory that the court and the duty that the court is attempting to create here can be used in any case. So what are the implications? Will this discourage the entire concept of continuous improvement? Will it be a disincentive to companies that want to continually improve their product? Companies, specifically life science companies, want to improve their product safety and efficacy, not simply to assist in the patients to which they are prescribed, but it gives them a tremendous competitive advantage to continuously improve their products. We know that the life science industry is highly competitive, and if they can make a product, a device or a drug that is safer, more effective, and simply better than their competitor's product, of course, they are going to attempt to continuously improve their product. If the decision is affirmed, will it harm innovation by encouraging companies not to invest in research and development, to in essence stand pat on the device that they have in the marketplace? It could result in uncertainty. What constitutes a safer but equally effective product? And at what point of the product development is this determination made? The alternative drug at issue in Gilead had not even proceeded to a Class 3 clinical trial. Gilead had taken the position that the incremental effects of the subsequent drug were not worth the investment. The plaintiff said, no, you intentionally tabled that for financial gain. Well, who makes that determination? We are already in the realm of the jury talking about what's safer and what is effective through the use of expert opinion testimony. But at what point is that determination made? And what constitutes safer? You have no control group of plaintiffs who are taking the original drug, or plaintiffs who are taking the improved drug, or plaintiffs who are taking no drug. And so what constitutes which is safer? Do you isolate on one side effect that's now improved with the new drug? Or do you look at it holistically as to overall safety, overall risk-benefit factors? In the context of non-drug products, where it's arguably less expensive to develop product improvements, this will have a potential detrimental effect of entities' ability or interest in doing that, when it's far easier for a non-drug entity to make these changes. They are at greater risk of being hit with an argument that they should have innovated their products because it was arguably far less expensive to do so. And if it was required in the case of the development of HIV pharmaceutical, then certainly it would be a duty that would be extended to sports equipment or household equipment or even industrial equipment. Sorry about that. The other implications in the Court of Appeals decision, they relied on at least 4 cases that did not even involve a life science drug or device. They based their decision on 4 cases in particular that had nothing to do with pharmaceuticals. One involving brakes on an automobile. The second involved a chicken enchilada and whether it was negligently prepared. Another involved a bobcat loader, and one involved a crane. Could it cause manufacturers to prioritize new products with only incremental improvements rather than a truly innovative product? This is an argument that Gilead made as to why they did not proceed with developing the second product, because they concluded that the product was equally effective and only provided an incremental improvement over the existing product. Patient advocacy groups who submitted amicus briefs, there are dozens of amicus briefs that have been submitted in this case on appeal. They argue that expanding a manufacturer's duty to include a duty to innovate would discourage manufacturers from prioritizing research into treatments for rare medical conditions. As you know, many pharmaceutical companies develop many versions of their drugs simultaneously. Again, at what point do you make the determination that one of those products could, initially, get approval, and secondly, would it have any a discernible different benefit to the class of patients who are already taking the existing medication? Other implications. Companies aren't structured to develop products specifically with California product liability in mind. As noted earlier, there's an international outlook for drug and device cases. Will they have to change their quality systems and the way that they develop new products because of the duty to innovate? Would they be more aggressive in the innovation, or would they be less aggressive? If they're more aggressive, at what point do they have to document further their risk-benefit analysis for the particular product and that's being improved? And will safety suffer? If companies are reluctant to develop new innovations for their products, are there untapped improved designs out there that would improve the quality of life of drug and medical device patients? Something else that came to mind in the preparation of this webinar are other implications. Is this the death knell for the Restatement Third of Torts, Section 6C? There's not a lot of case law on Section 6C, but it provides that a prescription drug or medical device is not reasonably safe due to defective design if the foreseeable risks of harm posed by the drug or medical device are sufficiently great in relation to its foreseeable therapeutic benefits that reasonable healthcare providers, knowing of such foreseeable risks and therapeutic benefits, would not prescribe the drug or medical device for any class of patients. That's a mouthful, so I've restated the restatement. In other words, if a reasonable doctor would choose to use the drug or device for any class of patients, knowing the risks, it's not defectively designed, regardless of whether there might be an alternative design. As I said before, not many cases have specifically adopted 6C. At least one district court in Colorado has adopted it in one case, but another has limited its application. And many states have adopted 6D of the restatement, which is the learned intermediary doctrine. But the Court of Appeal ruling would seem to directly contradict 6C, in essence turning it on its head, whereby you would have a device or a drug that would not be considered to be unreasonably safe or negligently designed or manufactured if it provided a benefit to any class of patients, regardless of whether or not those benefits are outweighed by the risks. It's very pro-manufacturer friendly. Although 6C has not been adopted in California, certainly I think Gilead would be the death knell for any hope of that in the future. Mark Twain, the great humorist and author, once said, "Progressive improvement beats delayed perfection." And what I learned in preparation for this webinar, that Mark Twain was also an inventor, and he invented the adjustable and detachable garment strap. So the next time you put on a belt, a bra, or suspenders, you can thank Mark Twain. What are best practices? What are the takeaways? Well, I think one takeaway is that continuous improvement is not optional, regardless of what happens in California, and regardless of what happens in various jurisdictions in the context of subsequent remedial measures. I think given the ISO requirements, given the quality system regulation requirements, entities certainly in the manufacture of life science products must continue to focus on continuous improvement of the safety and effectiveness of their products. But what can they do if they do develop a new product while an existing product is still on the market? They could institute a recall, but that's a very drastic corrective measure. But it's an option, of course, to recall the existing product, even though there is no potential problem with safety or effectiveness. But it's a drastic measure. They could retrofit if the product improvement allows for it. In some of our cases involving more expensive devices, if you think laser devices that are very expensive, several hundred thousands of dollars in some cases, they may be able to offer an upgrade, get the old product off the market, replace it with a new one, again, not because of any defect in the product, but because they want to avoid having to answer to the allegations that the product was upgraded or modified or improved because of some lack of new safety or effectiveness measure. They could institute a labeling change. Texas and Maine notwithstanding, they could do an alert, they could do a notification to their clients indicating that the new product is available, or they could, depending upon whether or not they make a determination that a new 510(k) is necessary, include labeling information in the existing device of the availability of the new improved product, and if necessary, include any necessary warnings, precautions, or other information. They could discontinue the prior version of the device altogether, replace it lock, stock, and barrel with a new improved device. Obviously, these are not only device dependent, but also manufacturer dependent, and whether or not these are viable would be a case-by-case determination. Another best practice is determine whether or not a 510(k) is required. FDA provides a guidance, and although it doesn't have the force of law, if you follow the guidance, then you're okay. And so if you go through the flow chart of whether or not the 510(k) is required, and the answer is yes, then they're going to have to file the 510(k) to incorporate the new device or develop the new device or market the new device. If they go through the process and no 510(k) is required, they must document that with a memorandum to file, preferably include their written risk-based analysis as to all the reasons why they thought it would be permissible to enact the device improvement, but not follow the 510(k). So are improvements and innovations mandatory for purposes of litigation risk management? Well, if it's just for product development and compliance purposes and regulatory compliance purposes, I would say yes. Continuous improvement is a requirement, and the company must have procedures in place in which they are actively exploring the continuous improvement in the safety and effectiveness of their devices. Is it mandatory for litigation risk management? I think that's a decision that's yet to be made. I think ultimately, though, companies have to think about compliance first, because that includes the components of safety and effectiveness. And if a jurisdiction like California is going to require them to do other actions, affirmative actions to innovate their products, I think that if they are complying with what's required by their 510(k), by the quality system regulation, that's going to be the best practices for them rather than anticipate what claim might be brought against them in California for a failure to innovate. That's all I have. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you again to Medmarc.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was really important information for our listeners to hear. I do have a couple of questions. First, how could a manufacturer use continuous improvement as a competitive advantage, other than by promoting new safety improvements?
I've seen it in some manufacturers where, take for example, the current um, indicated use is we'll call it use A. But to really secure their competitive advantage, they want to be able to promote and market the device for use C. But they can't get from A to C without doing an improvement to get to B, to be able to establish substantial equivalence of their device, of a predicate device. And it may be their device. So they will, after they get the clinical data to support not only the use of the device or promotion of the device for use B and use C, they will do a 510(k) for clearance for use B, not with an eye toward ever marketing or promoting that product for use B, but to then submit a second 510(k) to get clearance for use C. They have to go through the steps to be able to meet the requirements of substantial equivalence. But at the same time, they're providing clinical data along the way to show that each successive intended use or indicated use is supported by data showing that it provides reasonable assurances of safety and effectiveness to be able to support the clearance. So that's one way of doing it. Incorporates continuous improvement. It satisfies their obligations for continuous improvement. At the same time, being able to compete in the space where they want to compete in that indicated use C, as I've used in the example.
We've heard from FDA at industry meetings over the last few years that they're trying to be more proactive in working with industry. You spoke a lot about the decision that companies have to make about whether a new 510(k) is going to be required for certain changes. Do you have an opinion one way or the other about making contact with FDA about that decision? Because it can sometimes seem like their decisions are somewhat arbitrary.
Um,
What are your thoughts on that?
well, some critics might say FDA cannot get more cooperative with industry. Others might say no. We have resistance on getting this device cleared. It is a different world now, as from the litigation perspective, in terms of the lines of communication with FDA, whereby everything previously was in paper or meetings. If you get and I've just noticed this in my cases many times, you have a very long email trail with FDA that are very thoughtful exchanges between the professionals at FDA, in particular those very familiar with the device or the area of treatment or the device at issue. And so I think for purposes of, at least from our perspective, coming in after the fact, it's nice to see that there has been dialogue and that there have been discussions, pretty much in-depth discussions where FDA is asking, for example, do you have data to support X, Y, and Z? And then the company can point to what they've already provided, or they can get it and they can provide it to FDA or explain why it may not be necessary. Again, it's more frequently now than, having practiced for a long time, there was nothing of that sort many times in the regulatory file. But I think communication is probably the key to take advantage of it. I do believe that there are professionals at FDA that do want to make it not as onerous as it may seem, and to nitpick, provided that the company is doing what they're supposed to do. They're providing the clinical data and support for the proposed use or labeling change or design change or manufacturing change.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well, that these are really dedicated professionals who, like to nerd out about the topics
Yeah.
that you might be bringing to them. And documentation of that thoughtful justification for your decision can be really beneficial. One last question. You mentioned a lot about the various jurisdictions and their approaches to products liability and continuous improvement. But should litigation concerns ever outweigh continuous improvement considerations?
I would say no. I mean, that's why, I mean, that's probably a better question for the underwriters to address. But as far as litigation goes, it is far better, I think, for defense counsel to have to deal with a situation where a company has tried to do the right thing, has improved their product, and yes, you may subject yourself to having that used against you, but look at the alternative. The company is out of compliance. They're not in compliance with the quality system regulation if they have not adopted continuous improvement policies and procedures. Ultimately, in the bigger picture, on more complex devices, particularly medical devices, pharmaceuticals, there is a risk of particular patients being underserved, innovations not being pursued because of litigation fears. And so while I think litigation does have a seat at the table, I think ultimately devices are going to, and they probably should, fall on the side of continuous improvement to improve their products, to make them safer, to make them more effective. And if they're able to do that, I think the competitive advantage part will take for its will speak for itself. And I don't think the litigation concern should be the driving factor. I'm sorry to all the in-house attorneys, but I think that ultimately, if they're doing it the right way, if you have the companies that are doing it the right way, that are documenting what they do, and that they are doing those risk-based assessments and can document that, you should be well positioned for litigation to be able to access those documents, produce them, and tell the story as to, no, this isn't about a defect. This is about making the product better.
And I think that is a great note to end on. Matt, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank
This
you.
is a topic we encounter on a regular basis, so I know your expertise will be a valuable resource for our clients.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.